So, in the late 1960s, post-structuralism emerged as a reaction against the claims of structuralism. While structuralism aimed to understand the world of signs through a kind of heroic methodology, post-structuralism took a different approach. It adopted a more skeptical and anti-heroic stance, questioning those ambitious claims of mastery. Essentially, many post-structuralists were once structuralists themselves, who suddenly recognized some fundamental errors in their previous quest for an objective, self-regulating system. This shift led to a significant change in how we view literary works. Instead of seeing a literary piece as a stable, fixed work, post-structuralism encourages us to see it as an irreducibly plural text, open to multiple interpretations. This transition marks what we call the post-structuralist turn, where the focus moves from certainty to questioning and multiplicity. The movement was deeply influenced by the mix of euphoria and catastrophe that characterized the 1968 student uprisings in France. When the students couldn't break down the existing structures of state power, their energy shifted underground, focusing on subverting language itself. This is where post-structuralists come into play. They became wary of all totalizing, systematic thoughts, like Stalinized Marxism, which they saw as inherently terroristic and repressive. Instead, this shift led to the idea that power isn't just centralized in one place. It's more like a fluid, ever-moving force that seeps through every part of society. This notion really captures the spirit of 1968, disillusioned with traditional authority and eager to see power as something more diffused and elusive. It's a key point because it helps us understand how these events reshaped our thinking about authority, control, and societal change. Post-structuralism takes Ferdinand de Saussure's insight that meaning in language is a matter of difference to its logical extreme. If we think about a sign like cat, it's only cat because it is not cap or bat or mat or map. This means that every sign is actually made up of a potentially infinite tissue of differences. This realization really challenges Saussure's original idea that language is a closed, stable system. Instead, it shows us that meaning isn't fixed or tied to a specific word. It's more like a play of signifiers that go on endlessly. And this idea is what we call pressing linguistic difference to the infinite. It highlights how language is always in flux, shaped by an endless chain of differences rather than static meanings. All right, let's delve into how post-structuralism shifts our understanding of signs. While classical structuralism saw the sign as a kind of unity, where the signifier, which is the sound image, and the signified, or the concept, were just two sides of the same coin, post-structuralism takes a different approach. It pries these halves apart. In this perspective, the sign isn't a stable, fixed entity. Instead, it's more like a fleeting fix that exists between two constantly moving layers. Think of it as a snapshot in a dynamic process. Dictionaries help illustrate this idea because they show us that every signifier can point to multiple signifieds. Those signifieds, in turn, become signifiers for even more meanings. This creates a kind of endless chain. This ongoing chain exemplifies what we call the relentless deferment of meaning, meaning that meaning is always just out of reach, never fully settled. So, prying apart the signifier and the signified reveals that our understanding of signs is fluid, always open to new interpretations, and never entirely fixed. This is a cornerstone of post-structuralist thought, emphasizing the complexity and instability of meaning itself. In 1966, Jacques Derrida delivered a lecture titled Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, and this is really where his ideas started to take hold in America. What Derrida argued was that any concept of structure always relies on a center of meaning, something that holds everything together and guides the system. But interestingly, this center isn't something you can really analyze or break down itself. It's more like a foundational assumption. Humans tend to desire a center, like the I, God, or reason, something that guarantees our sense of being as presence. It's that need for stability and certainty. But Derrida's deconstruction shows us that these centers are actually just fictions. They're constructed to stop the play of signification, to freeze meaning and prevent it from flowing freely. So, when we think about Derrida and his critique of the center, we're really questioning the idea that there's a fixed point that grounds everything. Instead, he invites us to see how these centers are more like illusions, tools used to impose order and shut down the fluid, dynamic nature of meaning itself. This idea is central to understanding how Derrida challenges traditional notions of stability and meaning and pushes us to see the endless play of signs. Let's examine Derrida's critique of what is known as logocentrism, which is the Western philosophical belief in an ultimate word or truth that anchors meaning. This idea suggests that there is a fixed point of certainty, something that grounds our understanding of reality. Closely related to this is phonocentrism, which privileges the living voice, speech over writing. Traditional philosophy tends to see speech as immediate and authentic, while writing is viewed as secondary or even alienated. But Derrida challenges this hierarchy. He argues that speech itself is actually a form of writing, because it also relies on differences, absences, and traces, much like written language does. In this way, speech is not inherently more authentic or closer to truth than writing. This concept is crucial because it destabilizes the idea that there is one ultimate foundation for meaning. Instead, both speech and writing are processes that depend on difference and absence, highlighting the fluid and unstable nature of meaning itself. This fits into the broader theme of our presentation, which explores how language and meaning are never fixed, but always in flux. Derrida coined the term difference to capture the divided nature of meaning. This neologism might sound unfamiliar, but it's really about how meaning is never completely stable or fixed. It suggests that meaning is never identical with itself, because it's always deferred, always held over or still to come. In other words, when we try to understand something, we're constantly referencing other signs, other meanings that come before and after. Meaning is produced through a chain of signifiers, where each sign carries the trace of those that have gone before and those that are coming after. Because of this, no sign is ever pure or fully meaningful in its own moment. It's always part of this ongoing process. The term difference itself highlights two ideas: to differ, meaning to be different, and to defer, meaning to be delayed or held back. So in essence, meaning is always in flux, always shifting, never fully complete. This connects to our broader theme of how language and interpretation are dynamic, never absolute. So here we see Derrida's famous statement, "There is no outside of text," which might sound a bit abstract at first, but it really challenges how we think about the relationship between texts and reality. What he's suggesting is that it's impossible to draw a clear line between what's inside a text and what's outside of it. In other words, there's no absolute separation. This doesn't mean that physical reality doesn't exist. Of course it does. But our experience of that reality is always mediated through signs, symbols, and processes of meaning-making. Every time we think we've reached some kind of ultimate reality or truth, we find more text, more signs, more layers of meaning that extend beyond what we initially perceived. So reality itself is fundamentally textual, meaning it's always intertwined with language, signs, and interpretation. It's never purely raw or unmediated. This idea is central to understanding how we engage with the world. Our perceptions are always filtered through signs and chains of meaning, which makes the reality we experience inherently textual. This concept ties into the overall theme of the presentation, reminding us that our understanding of truth and reality is never straightforward, but always mediated through language and signs. In his 1968 essay, Roland Barthes introduced the idea of the death of the author, challenging the traditional view that the writer holds the ultimate authority over a text's meaning. Instead, he suggested that the author's metaphysical status should be stripped away, transforming them into a sort of crossroad, where countless citations and repetitions of language intersect and intersect again. This shift is quite significant because it frees the reader from being confined by a single, intended interpretation that the author might have had in mind. Instead, meaning is no longer something that the author injects into a text. It becomes something that is focused and created in the act of reading itself. This idea really emphasizes the active role of the reader and highlights how interpretation is open, fluid, and multiple, aligning with the broader theme of breaking down traditional authority structures in literary analysis. So here we see Barthes making an important distinction between the work and the text. The work is like a closed entity. It has a fixed meaning, something definite that we can interpret in a specific way. But the text, on the other hand, is much more open-ended. It's an ongoing process of structuration, meaning it's constantly evolving and creating meaning through its structure. Think of the text as this vast, irreducibly plural galaxy of signifiers, signs, symbols, and references that have no fixed starting point or clear ending. It's not like a transparent window revealing an external reality. Instead, it's a heavily crafted artifact. This means the text imposes its own version of reality on us, shaping how we perceive and interpret it. Another key point is intertextuality, the idea that any piece of writing doesn't exist in isolation. Instead, it constantly spills over into other texts, referencing or echoing them. This interconnectedness means that understanding a text often involves engaging with a web of other texts and meanings, which enriches its complexity. Overall, moving from work to text shifts our focus from fixed, authoritative meanings to a dynamic, pluralistic process of interpretation that's influenced by countless other texts and signifiers. Let's explore Barthes' distinction between two types of texts, the readerly and the writerly. Readerly texts, or lisable texts, are those where the reader is basically a passive consumer. They allow you to take in a fixed, predetermined meaning. Think of classic realist novels where everything is pretty straightforward, and the story is laid out clearly. On the other hand, writerly texts, or scriptable texts, are quite different. These are usually associated with modernist works, where the reader is encouraged to become a producer of meaning rather than just a consumer. Instead of a fixed message, the text invites you into a kind of playful interaction, a semi-arbitrary play of meaning that you help to generate. And this is where it gets fascinating. Reading in writerly texts becomes more like an erotic play, a creative, almost sensual engagement with the language, rather than just a cognitive process of decoding a fixed message. So, in summary, the key difference lies in the role of the reader, passive versus active, and how the text invites different kinds of engagement, aligning with broader themes of how we interpret and interact with literature. Jacques Lacan reinterpreted Freudian psychoanalysis by proposing that the unconscious is structured like a language. What he meant is that the unconscious operates through a system similar to language, with its own rules and structures. He identified unconscious processes with what he called the unstable signifier, highlighting how repressed desires are expressed through substitutions, both metaphoric and metonymic, that constantly shift and transform. This creates a kind of ongoing movement within the unconscious. Lacan also emphasized that meaning within the unconscious is never fixed. It's characterized by a constant fading and evaporation. In other words, the messages or symbols are always slipping away, never fully settling into a clear, final meaning. This makes the unconscious a bit like a modernist text, always in flux, never revealing all its secrets completely. The idea of the sliding of the signified beneath the signifier is crucial here. It means that the true meaning, the signified, is always just out of reach, hidden beneath the signifier. So, in this view, meaning is never fully present or stable. Overall, this perspective helps us understand how our desires, thoughts, and feelings are structured in a way that's more like a language, fluid, dynamic, and always in motion, adding a new layer to our understanding of the unconscious. So, here we see how post-structuralism challenges traditional ideas about the human subject. Instead of viewing the individual as an autonomous origin of meaning, it suggests that the subject is actually dissented. This means that who we are is largely shaped by language and intersecting psychic mechanisms. Lacan, in particular, emphasizes that the subject is split or divided. There's always this gap between the I who speaks and the I that's within the sentence. It's like there's never a complete unity, a kind of internal tension or split that defines our experience. This idea leads us to see the subject as always in process. We are not fixed entities. We are constantly being formed by the laws of our desire and the ways language shapes us. We have the capacity to be different from who we are at any moment, which ties into the overall theme of fluidity and the constructed nature of identity in post-structuralist thought. Michel Foucault saw discourse as a central human activity, one that's deeply connected to power. He believed that our use of language isn't just about communication. It's also a way that power is exercised and maintained. Institutions, for example, use discourse to police language, setting unspoken rules, what Foucault called the archive, that determine what can be said in a particular era. These rules shape our understanding of what's acceptable, true, or normal at any given time. Importantly, Foucault argued that power isn't something that's held by a single person or institution. Instead, it's dispersed throughout society and manifests through discursive practices. So, power is like a form of violence done to things, meaning it influences how knowledge is constructed and what is considered true or false. This leads us to a critical point. Claims to objectivity in knowledge are often spurious or misleading. There are no completely objective or entirely true discourses, only ones that are more or less powerful depending on the context and the social forces behind them. Overall, this perspective highlights how discourse, knowledge, and power are intertwined, each shaping and reinforcing the others within the fabric of society, which is a key theme in understanding how social realities are constructed. Julia Kristeva makes a fascinating distinction here between the semiotic and the symbolic. The semiotic refers to a flux of pre-Oedipal, rhythmic impulses. Think of it as a kind of raw, bodily energy that predates language as we know it. On the other hand, the symbolic is the ordered, rational language we use in society, structured, logical, and governed by rules. What's interesting is that this semiotic flux, which is closely associated with the mother's body, remains active beneath the surface of what we consider mature linguistic performance. So even as we communicate with words and syntax, that underlying rhythmic bodily energy is still there, influencing how we express ourselves. Now, poetic language plays a special role here. It's like a privileged space where the semiotic can break through the symbolic order. This disruption allows us to challenge or even subvert authoritarian social meanings that often shape our understanding of language and identity. And when this happens, we experience something called linguistic play and jouissance, moments of pleasure and creative freedom that come from mixing these two modes. It's a kind of linguistic rebellion, if you will, where the boundaries between the semiotic and the symbolic blur, opening up new ways of experiencing and understanding language. So feminism has really embraced post-structuralist ideas to challenge and deconstruct the violent hierarchy that has historically placed men above women. Simone de Beauvoir's famous observation that one is not born, but rather becomes, a woman is a perfect example of this. It anticipates the post-structuralist view that gender isn't something innate, but rather a social construct created through cultural and societal influences. Feminist theorists like Helene Sixis have taken this further by advocating for a creature feminine, or righting the body, which aims to disrupt what's called the phallogocentric order. That is, a cultural system that links truth and meaning to the phallus, or male power. The core goal here is to celebrate women's difference, not as something secondary or lesser, but as a subversive power that can challenge and transform existing norms and structures. All of this ties back to our overall theme of understanding how feminist theory and post-structuralism work together to question and reshape traditional ideas about gender and power. So, a key part of how Derrida's ideas spread in the United States was through a group at Yale, which included influential scholars like Paul de Man and J. Hillies Miller. These thinkers played a major role in interpreting and disseminating Derrida's concepts. Paul de Man, for instance, saw language as inherently rhetorical. That means he believed language isn't just about straightforward communication. Instead, it's full of tropes, figures of speech, that actually destabilize logical structures. He argued that these tropes prevent language from ever having a fixed, literal reference, which challenges traditional notions of meaning. For de Man, every act of reading is actually a misreading. Why? Because language always undermines its own meaning. It's a constant play, a sort of ongoing deconstruction where meaning is never fully stable. Then we have J. Hillies Miller, who added that deconstructive reading can be thought of as a parasite encrypted within the text. Essentially, this means that beneath the surface of what seems obvious, what we might call the apparent, straightforward reading, there's a hidden layer of meaning that's embedded, waiting to be uncovered through careful deconstructive analysis. All of this ties back to our overall theme, showing how deconstruction challenges traditional ideas of fixed meaning and highlights the fluid, unstable nature of language and interpretation. So, here we see that new historicism emerged in the 1980s as a way to challenge traditional views of history. It applies post-structuralist skepticism, meaning it questions the idea that history is a straightforward record of raw, objective events. Instead, it suggests that what we call history is actually a narrated story, something that's always already textualized. In other words, history isn't just a collection of facts. It's shaped by language, interpretation, and power dynamics. This perspective highlights that there's no single, unified history. Instead, we have multiple histories, discontinuous and often contradictory. These different histories reflect different perspectives and agendas, which means we should be cautious about accepting any one version as the absolute truth. Critics like Stephen Greenblatt take this further by arguing that the human subject, our sense of individual identity, is itself an ideological product. It's shaped by power relations, and we often find ourselves in moments where pure, unmediated subjectivity is actually unavailable. Connecting this to our overall theme, it emphasizes that history is not just a neutral record but a textualized archive, something that's constructed, contested, and always embedded within the power structures of its time. It's a reminder to approach history with a critical eye and recognize the complex layers behind what's presented as truth. So, in its later stages, post-structuralism took what we call an ethical turn, which means it shifted away from a strict focus on textual analysis and started to prioritize questions of ethics, haunting, and responsibility. Derrida's idea of hauntology is central here. It explores how the past, which he calls the foreign body, continues to inhabit our present in a ghost-like manner. This perspective encourages us to see the literary canon not as a collection of fixed, solid monuments, but more as a series of disembodied voices that call out to each other across open space, across time. Nothing is ever truly laid to rest. There's always some echo, some shadow of the past that keeps recurring. This ethical turn and the idea of hauntology remind us that we're constantly living in the shadow of what came before, and that engaging responsibly with the past is an ongoing, never-ending process. It pushes us to think about how history, literature, and ethics are intertwined, shaping how we understand our present and our responsibilities moving forward. By the 1990s, we saw a shift away from the heady days of high theory, moving towards a range of pragmatisms and what we now call post-theory orientations. While the so-called moment of theory, spanning from the 1960s through the 1990s, is generally considered to be over, its core insights haven't disappeared. Instead, they've been absorbed into how we approach contemporary criticism today. Post-structuralism, in particular, continues to serve as a principle of critical vigilance. It encourages us to question master narratives and to recognize the limits and assumptions behind seemingly dominant stories. This ongoing challenge pushes us to see the world differently, by occupying what I like to call a precarious middle ground, where questioning is always ongoing, never settling into fixed answers. So, in this context of post-theory and continuous theoretical vigilance, we're reminded that critical thinking is a dynamic process. It's about staying alert, questioning assumptions, and understanding that there's always more beneath the surface. This approach really ties into the overall theme of how theory evolves and shapes our understanding of culture and critique over time.